All right, let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Alex. I am the publisher and editor of the Xylom. We at the Xylom, we are a nonprofit news outlet with the mission of growing healthy and interconnected communities across the world. We are the only Asian American run news outlet dedicated to science, climate, and environmental coverage. And so we do a lot of reporting, especially around cross-border issues. We want to report on the intersections of environmental health impacts and democracy. So I put down some instructions in the chat. Feel free to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are, where you are physically based right now, and what institutions in our database or what schools that you've been to that you really care about understanding how they are faring right now with all the developments with the Trump administration and more. So I will first give a brief overview of what we're going to do today. I just want to remind everyone that this meeting is recorded. Currently, I have muted and turned off everyone's cameras, but when we get to the Q&A session, we will be opening up for questions. Then that's the time for you to unmute your mics. I just want to make sure I give a disclaimer here that all the materials available on this presentation are provided for general information purposes only. It is not legal advice, and we cannot guarantee to be complete or up to date, especially when the president of the United States often announces policy changes through his social media channels or through live appearances with the media. If you or your colleagues or your bosses or your workplace needs any legal advice surrounding H-1B workers, the best bet is to find a qualified lawyer who understands immigration issues to help you navigate through this. However, we are happy to talk a little bit about how that actually looks like when we get to that part of the story. So this is a rundown of what we're going to do today. I will first briefly talk about what the H-1B visa is, why the Xylom, as a nonprofit news outlet, covers the development of H-1B researchers, and then we'll go a little bit into the methodology, which is how we did this research, how we did this analysis, some of the key points that we found that might be helpful for you to understand the situation, some impacts, which is how you can make use of our data set and what are some things we plan to do, and finally we open up with the Q&A. So yeah, feel free to participate in the chat. Thank you, Ted, for getting us started. We welcome everyone. As far as I'm aware, there are everyone from Mexico, from Virginia, from New York, from Colorado. We're so glad that you're here. This is a national story, and we want you to have the most updated information as possible to get this started. So first, let me give a little bit of context of what the H-1B visa is. So the H-1B visa is a non-immigrant visa, which means that if you apply and get this visa, you do not become an American citizen or you do not become a permanent resident. That is not what the visa does. It is a special visa for people who want to perform services in a specialty occupation of exceptional merit and ability relating to a Department of Defense research and development project, or as a fashion model. The third item here doesn't really apply to what we're talking about, but what is important to understand is that H-1B visa holders are skilled workers. So they have special skills that they bring into the US, and most of the time they have to demonstrate that employers have to demonstrate hiring them does not lead to a competition between an American and a foreign resident for the same job. The H-1B visa is a 3-year visa that is renewable once, which means any person who gets an H-1B visa is eligible to stay in the US from 3 years to up to 6 years. After the 6 years, they are required to apply for a different type of visa in order to stay in the US. There is an annual cap of 65,000 new statuses or new visas each fiscal year. Each fiscal year in the United States begins on October 1st. That is why we're currently having a government shutdown, and it ends at the end of September. There is an additional 20,000 petitions for people who have already studied in the US for their undergrad and then for their master's degree. They are eligible to use this master's degree to additionally apply for the 20,000 petitions that are out there. However, nonprofits, schools of higher education, and their related groups or the government research organizations are not subject to this numerical cap. We will go into depth about this third provision here because this rule might change in the future. So why does the Xylom cover H-1B researchers now? So the first thing we want to emphasize is that we cover a lot of Asian American issues. And in this case, approximately 82% of all H-1B skilled workers are from two countries. 71% of them are from India, and around 12% of them are from China, which means a lot of the people who are directly affected by any policy changes will be Asian Americans, which are communities that we prioritize serving. A lot of these H-1B workers, apart from being postdoctoral fellows or early career faculty members in various universities, some of them engage in environmental and health research, and sometimes they are also given the opportunity to participate in spin-offs. For example, if there is some research project at a university that, for example, a professor wants to turn it into a business, turn it into a startup. Those are also places where H-1B skilled workers are being hired. So either it could be something related to biotech, it could be something related to artificial intelligence, related to computer science. Those are common places where skilled workers are hired. But this paradigm has been rapidly changing in this past month. Some of you might know that the president issued an executive order, which caused a lot of confusion and panic. Later, he clarified that this is a one-time $100,000 fee that's applied to new applicants. So people who already have an H-1B does not need to pay the $100,000. But if an employer wants to hire a new person or want to replace them with someone with a similar level of skill, they have to pay this $100,000 fee. That caused a lot of panic. We have seen news reports from other news outlets where people are trying to buy flights. Buy flight tickets are like $3,800 to just fly back over the weekend when he was announcing it, or they are very concerned that they didn't want to go on a flight to go home and see their parents in case they are trapped and they are unable to pay a $100,000 fee. There are two more things that are going on that really makes this area really uncertain for H-1B researchers and also for the higher education institutions that employ them. The first one is a proposed rule by the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security also runs ICE. So it replaces the current allocation system of H-1B visas with a weighted selection process that would generally favor higher skilled and higher paid petitioners, who are people who apply to get an H-1B visa. Normally, this does not affect higher education institutions because they currently are not subject to the $65,000 cap per year. But this is going to change as well because at the Republican-controlled House of Representatives and the Republican-controlled United States Senate, senators and representatives are introducing a bill to eliminate the current higher education exemption, which means that current people who have already come in or working for universities, they now have to fight with other people who apply for H-1B visas to work in private companies such as Facebook, Twitter, Google, to fight for the same 65,000 visas. We'll quickly get to why that will be important. So this is some background to help you understand where we are at right now. And so we wanted to understand where are the people who are already here with H-1B visas and making a difference at various schools in the United States. And that also includes various territories and commonwealths such as Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Virgin Islands. So the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, which we call USCIS, has a data hub. The data hub is available online. Everything is public records, which means anyone inside and outside of the US can go onto this website, click on the filters, and find their own employers or an employer that they're interested in to get data of how many H-1B workers were approved in a particular fiscal year. Here in this case, I use my alma mater, which is the Georgia Institute of Technology based in Atlanta, Georgia, as an example. We can filter out this information by fiscal year, by the employer name, the industry code, and the address of the person who is applying for the H-1B visa. So this is a dashboard that has a lot of data into it. It has information containing hundreds of thousands of people who have gone through this process since the 2009 fiscal year, which is starting from October 1st, 2008. That's the George W. Bush administration. So we've gone through the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and now the second Trump administration. All of this data is available online. You can download this data. However, when we did this project, the data was not very well done. If we were starting to enter a few employers at the same time, the system crashes, or that when the data you download it into a spreadsheet, it takes a lot of time to clean up. So what we did instead, which I do not recommend doing this yourselves, is that I manually click through all the schools that we deem to be of sufficient high research quality and activity, and we manually compiled the data and we double checked it by hand. And we wanted to have a sense of what are some universities with high research activity. And so we put out 3 qualifiers. So if any school meets one or more of these conditions, we add them to the list. The first one is land-grant universities, which comes from a system that was started in the late 19th centuries. Many of these schools are large agricultural state universities, and some of them are historically Black colleges and universities that were created because these land-grant universities that first appeared, they refused to integrate, which means that the states at the time, particularly in the South, they have to create an HBCU that is also land-grant to maintain segregation, but to provide an educational opportunity. So these are mostly schools that have been founded approximately 120 to 150 years ago, and they traditionally do a lot of agricultural research, a lot of research that is serving local state needs. The Sea Grant program is a newer program. It came about in the past few decades, which is a program that funds research along the coast of the United States. It is very broadly defined, so anywhere from the West Coast, the Pacific Coast, or the East Coast, the Atlantic Coast, the Gulf Coast, and even up to the Great Lakes, which is where it borders Canada. There are all schools that participate in the Sea Grant program. So we will talk a little bit more about how this is unique in our analysis. And finally, the third qualifier that we're using here is the R1 Very High Research Activity designation by Carnegie. So the Very High Research Activity roughly is for schools that have to meet at least $15 million of research funding a year. So $15 million a year, and they have to demonstrate that they graduate a certain number of PhD students or doctoral students a year. So this is to show that they have a baseline level of research activity, and this is a standard that is that is an automatic qualifier, which means if schools increase their research funding by a significant amount and promise to open more programs to help PhD students do research and graduate and get their PhD degrees, and to reduce a lot of peer-reviewed research, they will be put into this R1 bucket. And we've seen of all these qualifiers, they're really much stable, except for R1, where sometimes there are more schools being added to it when they do improve their research output. Land-grant and Sea Grant schools are pretty much set at this point, with the exception of New Jersey, which I will talk about later. So once we have all this data, we sort of compiled it into a big spreadsheet. I will make this spreadsheet available to you at the end of the meeting, so don't worry about it. All of this data is publicly available, and we want to make sure you will be able to make use of this information. And you can credit USCIS for some of the data, and you can credit us for compiling it. What we added to the USCIS data is the geographical coordinates, so people can understand where the school is, the designation of whether the school is private or public, or in Pennsylvania's case, quasi-public. So researchers or academic groups or civic groups can start to understand the different responses of private and public schools when it comes to regulatory changes. We also added whether these schools are a member of the Association of American Universities, which is traditionally a elective club of elite universities that do a lot of research output and predominantly produce most of the PhD students and get most of the research funding that's available in the U.S. We also wanted to make sure that we tell you whether the school has a medical school or has an engineering program, because those are two areas where a lot of research funding and a lot of skilled workers are being hired. Finally, we put in the amount of federal funding these schools have received for research and development in the fiscal year 2023, which started in late 2022 and ended in September 2023, because that's the last and most recent year we have complete data. We expect to update this as more recent data comes in after the government ends its shutdown. And so finally, we have a percentage column. I will explain this as we go on. This is what we call the burden percentage. So with the use of Data Wrapper, which is a open source software, we compiled all this information we got from a big spreadsheet, and we tried to share it in the form of a visible and interactive map. So here, let me provide a link to our reporting. So you can bookmark this link, and you can feel free to click around. Feel free to use this afterwards, or recycle some of the data for your own reporting. So in this area, we have a whole map of the U.S., and we highlighted all these schools based on where they're physically located. And we added more information when a user clicks on a particular circle to understand what the school is. I used an example of the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. It's almost like a nutrition label when you go to the grocery store. We have a nutrition label that says what its current state is, and also what are some key statistics of the school are, and also what we expect this school will face in terms of cost issues moving forward. So this is what we found. Across America's land grant, sea grant, and R1 very high research activity universities, 13,464 H-1B skilled workers were hired between the first quarters of fiscal year 2025. This is important to recognize for two things. One, because these are research universities, they're currently capped exempt, which means they're not fighting for that 65,000 number of H-1B visas per year. They can hire these workers at any time of the year. We also recognize that this is only a partial data for this fiscal year. The fiscal year just ended last week, which means we will wait for a while for the whole year's data to come out. What we can start seeing here is that because these visas are available for a 3-year period, so you can do some mental math and roughly multiply this number by 3, and you can say that, oh, okay, so we know at least there are around 40,000 people here in the US that are on H-1B visas working across different schools in the United States. And for some of them, they might consider getting a renewal. While I don't have the data right now of how many people who've got their first H-1B visa approved and get them successfully renewed and they stay in the same place, but you can start to have a sense of, the ballpark of the number of H-1B skilled workers that are inside the United States. We're looking at a high 5-figure or even a low 6-figure number of people that are employed across the United States higher education institutions. And that doesn't include other schools that did not fall into the land grant, sea grant, and R1 research universities buckets. There are certain schools that they might do less research, but they have research institutions or they have partnerships that they hire different people to get this done, or they come from a different background that, so they just fall through the cracks of our analysis but that doesn't mean they don't hire H-1B beneficiaries. So talk a little bit about the outliers. So the top 5 schools that have hired a lot of H-1B visa worker holders this year are Stanford, the University of Michigan, Washington University in St. Louis, the University of Maryland in College Park, and also Emory University. So these are schools that are very large. There's a good mix of being private schools and public schools, but they've hired a lot of H-1B workers. If you think about it, right? If you come from if you come from a news outlet or you come from a research organization, how many of your workplaces have 500 employees? And to imagine that there are 510 employees in Stanford that are on work visas, you can imagine how big this operation can get. Most of these schools have engineering schools and law schools and also medical schools. The only exception on the top of the list is Emory University. They do not have an engineering program themselves, but they have a joint program with Georgia Tech, which is my alma mater, for biomedical engineering. But for the ease of analyzing this data, we just categorize them as not having an engineering program. These are also schools that are they're more historical, and they're all part of the Association of American Universities. If we look at the very bottom of this list, right, these are what we call the loaners, which means they have hired one person on an H-1B visa to work at these schools. So there's Delaware State University, there's Fairleigh Dickinson University, Norfolk State University, and Virginia State University. So what we've been noticing in terms of these loaners is that most of them are smaller private schools, and mostly in New Jersey, and I'll explain why later. And also, they're mostly historically Black colleges and universities. It appears to us that a lot of historically Black colleges and universities have a smaller research output, and they're smaller in terms of total people who go to those schools, who work with those schools, and that's why they hire fewer people and they hire fewer immigrants. It's also important to recognize that these schools have much smaller research funding sources. They also have traditionally, in the case of HBCUs, been underfunded and defunded by states, which extends a pattern of discrimination that we've seen for decades. So for New Jersey, this is a very interesting case. New Jersey has a lot of schools that are participating in their Sea Grant program, and we included them into this research because we want to be consistent in our measurements. However, because New Jersey Sea Grant program is basically, if you pay $2,500 a year, you can join a membership, as opposed to other states where they require state legislation to admit a new school or to assign a new school to be a Sea Grant school. That means they have a broader membership of smaller schools who are just happy to be here. And that's why when we go look at burden, which will be the next thing we do, you will see that New Jersey schools are mostly outliers, and we will acknowledge them as we go on. So this is the second map that we make. So the first map that we make were mostly circles. The circles are based on the sizes of how big these schools are in terms of how many people they hired. So now we introduce what we call the burden index, which is we divide the cost that these schools need to hire the same number of people by the amount of federal research funding that they received in the most recent year. So for example, if Stanford University has 510 H-1B visa holders, we multiply 500 by 100,000 because that's the number of H-1B visa holders times the amount of money they need to pay to the Trump administration to hire a new H-1B worker. And then we divide this number by the very large research funding that Stanford has gotten from the federal government. And you'll see that Stanford is somewhere around here, which is a very small triangle, which means that even though Stanford hires a lot of H-1B workers, because they receive so much funding, If they want to keep hiring 510 new H-1B workers next year, the additional amount of money in terms of their research output is relatively small compared to other schools. However, as you can start to see here, right, there are schools that their triangles are much larger than places, especially along the coast. So these are schools which, if they want to hire the same number of H-1B visa workers in the next financial year, they would need to fork up a lot of money relative to what their current research funding is in order to keep hiring the same level of talent. Again, we sort of, broken down this by public school, private school, and we now go into some of the schools that are most burdened by this situation. As you can see here, some schools definitely stand out. Most of these, in terms of the top 10, all the schools that are in asterisk are schools that we call R2 research schools. So they have high research output. They might be land grant or sea grant universities, but they do not have, $15 million of funding for research per year. Most of them are in New Jersey, as I explained, because they have a special sea grant program that has a broad membership. So William Patterson, Keene University, Stockton, Monmouth, and the College of New Jersey, they're all based in the state of New Jersey. So we put them in here for posterity. But if we only include R1, which is very high research output institutions, the list looks a little bit different. So the top 10 of these schools are Binghamton University, which is in upstate New York, Indiana University in Indianapolis, Texas Tech, University of Tennessee Health Science Center, UNLV, which is based in Las Vegas, Nova Southeastern, based in Florida, Ohio University, which is based in Southeast Ohio in the Appalachians, Southern Methodist University, or I like to call it SMU, which is based somewhere around Dallas, Old Dominion University, based in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia, which is Southeast Virginia, and finally University of North Texas, which is based in Denton, around the Dallas area of North Texas. So if we look at these schools that are most burdened by the rule changes, right, some things immediately stand out. Of the top 10 schools that are on this list, that are very high research activity universities, almost all of them are based in states that voted for Donald Trump in 2024 and are under a Republican trifecta, which means the governor's house and both chambers of their state legislatures are under control by Republicans. The only exception to this is Binghamton University, which is based in upstate New York in a rural area in the Appalachians, and Old Dominion University. Virginia voted for Kamala Harris, but it has a Republican governor, and they are having an election in approximately 5 weeks. And their state legislature is currently split between Democrats and Republicans. However, the states that are most impacted are, for example, Texas, Tennessee, Nevada, and Ohio, Florida. So these are mostly larger states that have been run by Republicans in the past years. If we look at the same list again, you'll also notice that many of them are public schools. Among the top 10, Nova Southeastern and Southern Methodist are the only schools that they are, that they have private, which means a lot of these schools also depend on receiving some form of state funding to keep this work continuing, and also that the state funding comes along with federal funding. This also opens up a situation where these public universities are subject to decisions made by, boards of regents or state, board of directors of their schools. Many of them could be appointed by the governor or by the legislature of their states. So this is important to understand that these public institutions, some of them might have fights with their own state officials or legislators over the future role of their schools, but it also means that the state has a responsibility and the ability to respond whenever the schools are facing a financial crunch, and in this case, to maintain the same level of talent as they always have. So what we're looking at this map, right? We see that Texas, Ohio, Indiana, and Florida are mostly affected. There are still a lot of things that we want to really understand moving forward because this is a developing situation, and we also don't have complete data yet. And when it comes to higher education in the U.S. Another caveat I do want to add is some of these schools don't have most recently available data. We are not sure whether it's simply that they forgot to submit the data or that, maybe some of the data got corrupted. But some of the schools that, we're trying to understand on this list, they did not submit their data or they only have data that is from a couple years ago. And there are occasionally some schools who simply don't hire H-1B workers. We are not quite sure whether that is a rule set out by the state or it's just a decision that the school made that they didn't felt like they had the need to hire a skilled worker to add to what their school was already doing. I'll also add that in this map we're looking at, most of the schools are located in college towns or in very large cities. So this mostly reflects urban America. The only exceptions to these are usually HBCUs, which are in very small towns across the southern United States. So we do not have a good sense of how this affects the rural United States. But it is still important for us to understand the landscape of this development across all 50 states and also the commonwealths and the territories of the United States, because we will have a baseline level of data to start doing more reporting moving forward. So this is a little bit about the impact of our work so far. So since we published this database, approximately 5 or 6 news outlets have already asked us to get a set of this data. We make this freely available to anyone who wants it. So if you like to get this information, just put this down in the chat, or you can email me afterwards. I will make sure I put my email up here. The Jersey Vindicator, for example, has done an article citing our data. H-1B crackdown put up in New Jersey academic research hubs from Rutgers to Princeton. So our data set is a national data set, but you are very welcome to pick some parts of the data set and talk about your own state, talk about your own city, or talk about specific types of schools. For example, schools that have engineering programs or schools that have medical schools. Some of the next steps that we're already looking at as a newsroom are as follows. We plan to update our database with the complete fiscal year data after the shutdown concludes. We do not have a sense of how long the shutdown is going to last. A lot is on the line, and it doesn't seem like the situation is budging, which also means that even if we try to ask for information from federal government officials, we're very likely to get an out-of-office response. Because this database goes all the way back to the 2009 fiscal year, we are trying to figure out if we have the capacity to expand this database. Expanding this database will help us understand whether H-1B hiring conditions have changed throughout different presidential administrations. For example, if a Republican is president versus if a Democrat is president, and also to understand this with the caveat that we did have a huge pandemic in the past few years during the Biden administration, and also with the understanding that economic fluctuations or new rules that have been passed by various presidential administrations might change the appetite of schools to hire H-1B skilled workers. And then our next goal is to also survey institution officials to understand their change in plans for hiring in the fiscal year 2026, which just started. We think it would be helpful to put out a survey and ask all these higher education administrators to see that if they have plans, or if the state or if their boards have plans to freeze hiring, to not hire any H-1B workers anymore, or to try to get a new funding source to pay for that $100,000 fee that the president wants to get. Finally, we would love to work with local and national news outlets to do deep dives into some outliers, right? Because we named some of the schools that are most at risk of this new policy change, We wanted to see like what does that mean for these schools, or what does that mean for the communities that really depend on the research these schools are doing. We also think it's really important to put a human face to the issue, because we just showed you two maps, but those are 13,000 people. That's a lot of people. So what do these people do? Why are they in the United States? Why do they think it's so important to develop their academic and research futures here? And what are some considerations they're having right now? Are they planning to return to China or India? Are they planning to move to another country? Are they planning to buckle down here and do as much as they can? We want to try to start figuring out what that looks like on the ground, and how communities are responding to these political changes. And last but not least, you are very welcome to cite, adapt, and localize our data set with attribution. So I am sharing a link to this data set. Please make a copy of this data set and feel free to credit us. So we want to encourage you to do as much as you can with it. You can use this to do academic research. You can use this to communicate with your employees or with your colleagues about, okay, so like start making plans for what happens next. If you're a person who likes to talk on TikTok or Instagram Reels, feel free to take a screenshot of the data and talk about it. The best way for to raise awareness or to engage with people who are concerned or needs convincing is to talk about it. And finally, we also welcome that you share the data with your local elected officials. Your local elected officials have a lot to do, to make potential changes or to make potential responses to all these developments. For example, if your city has a city higher education system, maybe they want to understand how city funds will be affected of all this. If you know a local congressperson or a senator, then they have a vote in their hands, which is they want to determine whether it is a good idea to remove the exemption of all these tens of thousands of H-1B researchers in higher education institutions and make them fight with people who work in the private sector to get these H-1B visas. As far as current industry data shows, people who work in industry are traditionally paid much more than people who work in higher education. That's just the way it is. And when the lottery system is being proposed, that is something that could prioritize people who work in industry as versus to higher education. The rule that the Department of Homeland Security, it is a proposed rule, which means you can write comments, you can write, you can write, what you think or what your institution thinks about this proposed rule change, or you can bring this up to your local elected officials so they can offer their views about this as well. So the Xylom, we're really committed to continuing reporting about environmental health and democracy. So what we're trying to do with this is to just put the lay of the land out and to understand how, especially all these researchers who predominantly do environmental or health or other kinds of high quality cutting edge research, the uncertainty they're moving forward. But we love to hear from you about anything that's happening on your campus or anyone that is facing these difficulties. So you can find us on social media. You can email me. My email is on the screen right now. And you can also contact me through Signal, which is a secure messaging channel. And we can offer to keep what you send us anonymous to protect your privacy. Finally, the Xylom is a reader-funded news organization. As a nonprofit, we don't take money from, politicians. We don't take, we don't have a paywall. A lot of our reporting, such as the one that you just experienced, is funded by readers, funded by you, and funded by your colleagues, your friends, your family members. And this allows us to move at the speed of the news. This reporting that we just did beat Forbes, which is a very large news organization, by 12 days, which means we got this data out ahead of them by almost 2 weeks. And we are really proud that we are small and nimble. We also need your support to keep doing this work because this is my full-time job. So if you're willing and able, please feel free to share, our work and also our donation link, to help continue supporting this journalism that really matters. So really, I want to thank everyone for again coming to this webinar. I'm going to start opening up us for questions. So if you have a question, you can use the hand raising function in the chat and to indicate that you have a question. Thank you again for being part of this. All right, so what I will do now is to allow you to turn on your microphone and video, and Blanca, you can start asking your question.
Nice. Thank you so much for this webinar and share with us your your methodology. My question is, which are your favorite tools to work with data? And another question is, in the Xylom, I don't know how to pronounce. Do you use Python or something to work with data?
Yes, so to make sure I hear this question correct. So, what are some tools we use to make this analysis, and whether we usually use coding to do, this work? So the quick answer is that for this particular project, what we used was Data Wrapper and Excel, or Google Sheets. So I do not know how to code at all. I went through college. The only programming language I know is MATLAB, which is not a real programming language. So what we try to do is to, do a lot of this analysis without knowing how to code. And these are some softwares that really enable us to like visualize this data without putting too much data work into it. And we think this is also a great example of, making the process easier for our colleagues and partners in other news outlets, so they don't feel like there's a huge barrier that they have to have somebody in their staff that knows how to code in order to do this kind of work. Everything that we share out, it's already built in, so they can just plug in, they can plug and play. They can just put this on their website, and the data will be updated in real time. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much.
Hi, another question?
Yeah, yeah. Well, can I write you with questions about your business model?
Yes, absolutely. If you have any questions about how we did this, feel free to email me. Happy to talk about it. I'm also happy to talk about how this kind of reporting is funded. And I think there's a lot of consternation among nonprofit outlets like us of the current financial situation that we're all in. I'm happy to think of ways that we can collaborate together, or to share some of the costs of doing this reporting together. Anything that can help really make an impact, we're all open to figuring out ways to work together.
Nice. That's all. Thank you so much.
All right, any more questions? If there are no more new questions, I like to give 15 minutes of your time back. Feel free to copy down my email and my contacts, and if you have any follow-ups, I'm happy to answer them on an individual basis. Once again, thank you for your time, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks. Have a nice day.
Bye.